and welcome to the Scotichronicast, the podcast which discusses all things relating to medieval Scotland. I'm your host, Dr. Kate Buchanan. This is episode 14, and I am excited to be joined by Dr. Adrián Maldonado. Welcome to the Scotichronicast.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. I'm very much looking forward to chatting to you about your research and what you're doing. It's super exciting. Why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners a little bit?
Well, hi, everybody. My name is Adrián Maldonado. I'm Glenmorangie Research Fellow at National Museum Scotland. I am an early medieval archaeologist, so I will tread carefully here on what is mostly a history podcast. But I will say I was trained in history initially. I have a degree in medieval history, so I was one of you once, but I saw the light. So I did medieval history at Harvard University, and it was fine. But I came to Scotland on a semester abroad in my third year, and being here in Scotland and seeing the things that I was formerly only reading about, frankly, blew my mind.
Yeah.
So I finished the degree in history, and I came back to Scotland as soon as I could to do a master's in medieval archaeology at Glasgow Uni. And then I never looked back. I got a Ph.D. there at Glasgow Uni, and have been sort of teaching early medieval archaeology more or less ever since, until 2018, when I got this incredible job at the National Museum, where I currently work today.
Excellent. Well, let's first briefly touch on what drew you to medieval history in the first place, and then we can dig into more details on the archaeology side of things.
Sure. Yeah, well, I was just kind of interested in old things generally. I'd like to say that I read J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit at too early of an age, and it kind of ruined me.
Yes.
And it just I was just an impressionable young kid growing up in Puerto Rico, and I had an older brother who was much cooler, of course, and he just he comes home with this thing. And he says, you have to read this. And I don't know how old I was. I was, maybe 10 years old.
Right.
And that was it. When I got through to the Lord of the Rings, it felt like reading. It felt like discovering a new world.
Yeah.
And if you've read the Tolkien books, it's grounded in a medieval sensibility, even though it really deals with ancient prehistory.
Oh, yeah.
But it's medieval-ish anyway. And that's what got me. And so it was in high school, and I was doing the big reread of Tolkien. And so when I went to college, I decided to do history, and of course it ended up being medieval history.
Right.
And as I say, I came on a semester abroad just to spend a few months away in a medieval institution. I wanted to go to Oxford because I knew about Oxford, and I ended up. We had a program in St Andrews University in Scotland, and I knew nothing about Scotland nor St Andrews itself, to be perfectly honest.
Right.
And but it ticked all the boxes. Has beautiful medieval ruins.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful medieval town itself. What could be better? So I went there, and that was it. Being in St Andrews, surrounded by the medieval ruins, the walking on the medieval streets, and having incredible lecturers, one of which, by the way, this will interest you, one of which was a castles class.
Yeah.
It was it was an optional module running at the time. Hugh Kennedy, who's I believe he's more known for his sort of crusades work, but he was there at the time, and he was teaching a class on medieval castles. So I took that, and that really got me going. And it was just one trip that I took. I took a bus to the Borders because I'd heard the Border Abbeys were great.
Oh,
so I went to see the Border Abbeys, and that was it. That was the nail in the coffin of my history career.
Those abbeys in the Borders, they're just so amazing.
No, it was mind blowing, and so I'd seen the one medieval cathedral, St Andrews Cathedral there, and so and seeing the ruins there was mind blowing. But then going to the border abbeys and seeing how they were so similar in form, and yet each one of them has these differences, and it was just, there was some little bit of mystery there. It was like, oh, if you could kind of crack the code of how they are a little bit different in each way, and why they're different in that way, that would be interesting. And I think there I just never looked back.
Yeah. Oh, I do. I really love the abbeys down in the border. Do you have a favorite one?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, this is kind of a, I was big into ruins for a long time. I was a ruin snob. If it was a complete roofed structure, it was, forget it.
This is too well preserved.
That's right. I was like, nah, not real enough somehow. But then, of course, I've traveled a lot since then, and I used to think there was nothing better than Kelso, because it was the most ruined. you know? But then I went to Durham, and Durham's a living, breathing cathedral. But there is just something ominous and heavy and claustrophobic, even though it's enormous. There's just something about the Romanesque architecture there that for some reason it just gets me more than the Gothic stuff. It's just I can't even explain it. It's like being in a spaceship. It really does feel that way to me.
Right.
You go in there and you're just like it's just a different kind of feeling. So there's something about Durham that really. Sorry, I'm a big fan of Scotland. I've dedicated my life to studying Scotland, but Durham was close enough to Scotland at one point.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a fascinating site as well. I've always had an extra fascination with Jedburgh. It's just, and I realize I have like this bias on my memory of these sites, because like if it was a gorgeous day that I happened to visit a site, I tend to like have much fonder memories than the places that I've visited when it was, rainy or extra cloudy or whatever. And I remember the day that we visited Jedburgh was just beautiful, and it just made the place just seem extra fantastic.
Definitely. I'm with you there. Jedburgh is where my bus led off. I think that was the first one that I hit, and then I tried to do the other ones on one day and get back to St. Andrews. It was a flying visit for the rest of them, but I did make it, and but Jedburgh's special because that was the first one.
Yeah, cool. All right, so then you came over to Glasgow. What did you then study while you were at Glasgow?
So they had a program at Glasgow University. This was 2004, if I can admit that. In 2004, they had a program called Medieval Archaeology, specifically Medieval Archaeology, and that was the only program of its kind that I could see, besides one in Durham and one in York, I believe, that had the same kind of outlook, where it was not just an archaeology program with medieval courses. This was a medieval archaeology as a way of thinking about archaeology, so that and it was in Scotland, which is where I really just wanted to be back in Scotland, really. So it came down to Durham and Glasgow, and just wanted to come back to Scotland, really. So I went there, and it was such a great choice, because it was a small program, only 6 master's students that year, me included, and we all got on so well. It was actually the teaching team. So if you know anything about early medieval archaeology, you'll know these names: Stephen Driscoll, Ewan Campbell, Colleen Beatty, Jeremy Huggett on the archaeology side, and then on the history and Celtic side. So at Glasgow Uni, they do this amazing thing where the archaeologists and the early medieval historians get along really well. A couple of them are married, but they all kind of came up at the same time, and they all kind of study the same thing, but from different perspectives. So we also had classes from David Brune and Thomas Owen Clancy. And it was just looking back at it now, such the dream team. And so I wasn't interested in early medieval anything. I still want to do 12th century, just in general, abbeys and cathedrals. I didn't really have anything more than that, but that was a specifically early medieval oriented team. Right. And just with the kind of classes that we had, a field trip to York led by Colleen Beatty to see Jorvik, the Viking Museum there.
Yeah.
And just all the amazing things that we were able to see on field trips. Yeah. I was, within one semester, I was enamored with the Picts. I was still going to do churchy things. I was still doing Pictish churches, but it was that. It was kind of like, I wanted to study those cathedrals and abbeys, but now I was more interested in what was underneath. So why they were there, what came before those priories. And Jedburgh obviously had a lot of that. They have sort of bits of Roman architecture that were used there. And, and so there is a through line there. It was just still the churchy sites that I'd fallen in love with, but different perspective on.
Yeah, that's cool. And then carried on that research through your PhD.
Yeah, so I carried on doing the archaeology of early Christianity in general. And so that, looking at the archaeology, there were very few churches, physical churches that have been excavated. There's only a handful. So it turned out to do it at a PhD level, you had to find something that was sort of meatier. And it became about burial. So at Jedburgh, there have been excavations, and some of the things that they found were some of the early burials there. There were burials in an early form of coffin called the long kist. They're sort of stone slabs making a coffin. I don't think they're terribly early there at Jedburgh, but this was the kind of common thread. Every time I looked at what was underneath, read up on what was underneath, generally speaking, the earliest thing that they would always find was early burials oriented east, facing east. So in the quote unquote Christian manner. And so the PhD became about studying early medieval burial and asking the question, what makes it a Christian burial? Can we tell using archaeology? And that was the PhD. It was called Burial in Christianity. And I was trying to be like a little provocative by calling it Burial in Christianity in late Iron Age Scotland.
Oh.
Yeah, because I had this sort of really sort of kind of an evangelical thing at that point saying, listen, even though we have a few names and dates, it's still pre the historical record. And, I thought it would be so edgy and exciting to say, I'm writing about Christianity, but in the Iron Age. And so, but then I never followed through on that. All of my publications have been about early medieval burial, not Iron Age burial,
Right.
But there you go. I wanted to take a fundamentally historical question that it had been at that point and look at it through an archaeological lens. And that's where I kind of kicked off.
That's cool. So in our emails, you had touched on a couple of things that I would love to hear you lay out in a little more detail. So you said that you were focusing on or trying to avoid the discussion of the Celtic Church in all of this. So I think first we should maybe define kind of what the ideas around the Celtic Church are within the context of Scottish history, and then I'd love to hear what you did with that.
Sure. I mean, what a question, but these are not easy ones to answer. But I mean, okay. But anybody this is something that that you have come back to a lot in the interviews for this podcast, which I find. This is why I listen to this. Yours is, by the way, the nerdiest podcast I listen to. So thanks for that. But wow. in a good way. This is a compliment.
Excellent.
But one of the things that comes up in many of the episodes is a certain issue that people are having to deal with regard to Scottish history, and that it's about issues of, I guess you could call them stereotypes, or you could be academic and say the historiography of the study of Scotland's past. You have to deal with a lot of these kind of albatrosses, If it's early modern, then you have to deal with Highlanders and Kilts and Klansmen, the clans. And if you deal with medieval things you have to deal with. The wars of independence, England versus Scotland, issues about that. And if you deal with early medieval Christianity, one of the things is Celts, this word Celts. Celtic Christianity is part of that. It's just an overarching lens in which whatever's going on in Scotland is stranger and less part of the mainstream, okay? Just in general. And people who study Scotland's history can kind of relate to that in some fashion or another. It's one of the recurring things. Celtic Christianity is one of the things that, in the medieval archaeology course, we read this real groundbreaking article by Wendy Davis called The Myth of Celtic Christianity. And it was in a book about Wales, she's a Welsh historian, and it was about Celtic Christianity in Wales, but actually it applied absolutely everywhere. And it's just, laying out the case that there is no such thing as a unified Celtic church in which everyone in Ireland, Scotland, and Wales and Cornwall believed one thing, and it was different from the opposite, which was invariably called the Roman Church.
Right.
There's so much sort of Reformation and after politics involved in that view, but it was important beginning the PhD that I kind of, I said, basically the first chapter of the PhD is dealing with this question about how previous studies of Christianity in Scotland have all kind of had to deal with that and either buy into it or completely shrug it off. And, we can't do either. We have to say and show how it has affected historical and archaeological arguments in the past. So part of it is just dealing with it and say how much of this argument is affected by this notion of a belief in a sort of different kind of Christianity. And if you say that it's not a real thing, then where does that leave us? It just leaves you with the evidence. And that evidence, stripped of that sort of lens, stripped of stripped of that veneer of being Celtic and different, if you just look at the evidence and you compare it with Anglo-Saxon burial, early Irish burial, all the burial practices on the continent at the time, if you look at it that way, Scotland's early medieval burial, early Christian burial, doesn't look very different at all. It's all going on at the same time. It changes at the same time as there are changes in England, everything about it kind of it develops along the same kinds of ways. It ebbs and wanes at the same rate and tempo as it does in places where there are other historical explanations. So in England, to take Anglo-Saxons as an example, they, the traditional explanation is there are migrants and invasions and they change the way people bury. But we are getting these changes in burial at the same time in Scotland, where there is no, in places where you just can't use that invasion hypothesis as the explanation, and so there's something else going on. There are other things going on that have nothing to do with these historical or pseudo-historical, with regard to Celtic Christianity, pseudo-historical explanations that we put on them. There are other factors at play. There are social factors at play. There are things economic, and which is why things are changing. The way people relate to one another after the Roman economy, the Roman style economy has sort of faded away. Different power structures have to come into force. And that level of explanation, society and the social bonds that hold it together, that explains death and burial, not this thing about we have to bury this person as a Pict because an archaeologist might look at him in 1,000 years and wonder if he was a Pict or not. That doesn't make any sense. If you've ever been to a funeral, there are certain circumstances in which ethnicity, I guess, might play a role in how you bury someone, but it's mostly about emotion and fear and anxiety about what happens to that person's body and their soul. And that's what animates a funeral, a death, and so I try to explore the change, if you like, I guess, the sort of conversion period through this anthropological way. that's kind of it. And having that Celtic Christianity thing to rail against just kind of gave my research a direction,
Yeah.
an agenda, if you can say that. It gave it some kind of, although this is a very niche PhD about something that only very few people would ever care about, the bigger point of it is to do with what it means to study the past in Scotland.
Yeah. No, and it's you've touched on a lot of things that I think are very important. Like, yeah, it's very hard to get around these like massive preconceptions about the historical narrative sometimes. And especially when it's something that is so embedded in the narrative, like the idea of a unified Celtic church. And even like I would say this time, like even the idea of a unified Roman church is just ridiculous. Like, yeah, there is some organized structure, but it's not anything like what we can see later on as a unified church.
Too right.
And yeah, it's people looking at what we have today or what our understanding is today and then applying that backwards in a way that they shouldn't.
Yeah. But that's what makes it fun. That's what drives you to kind of do the research, even though, you know, what a crazy thing to be driven to do, research into the early medieval past. I mean, that's bonkers. That's genuinely bonkers. But it's having that sort of thing is what animates you. It's sort of trying to get it right in that kind of larger sense. Yeah, it gives you that drive.
Right. And it makes it, you know, more important. There's like a lot more value when you're trying to be like, no, this is not actually what was going on. Yeah. So then you've moved on to some other research projects since then. Were you able to continue on sort of looking at burials, or have you moved a little bit beyond burials?
Yeah, I've continued. This is a difficult one to answer. Yes, I've continued to do research on death and burial, but I've also, so my PhD was in 2011, and I've been very lucky in that I've been able to get work. I'm not going to say continuously, but I've been able to continue to get work in early medieval archaeology for the most part. But I have been, I don't know, there's a cutoff point at which you can stop calling yourself an early career academic, but I feel like I'm a permanently early career academic.
Yes.
I've never had a job that's longer than, up until the job that I have now. I'm at the National Museum. This is a 3-year gig, and it's the longest contract that I've had. You know, it's the most job that I've had. And so what that means, and this is not a complaint, again, I've been able to do a lot of early medieval archaeology for all that. But what it means is that you've had to move from one project to another and start teaching and doing a lot of teaching cover, maternity cover I've had. And every single time you do one of those new teaching gigs, you are teaching a tranche of new courses that you had never taught before, which is awesome in its own way. It's mind expanding. To give you an example, when I was at the University of Chester for 2 years, again, research cover and maternity cover, 2 jobs, but subsequently, I mean. But while I was there, I was teaching everything, every period of archaeological history and thought, from prehistory onwards to theory. And I also did this crazy course called Contemporary Archaeology. And at that point, I had never done any teaching of contemporary archaeology. That is the archaeology of the time we live in now.
Oh, interesting.
And for me, this is the absolute test of all your archaeological theories. That is to say, if you have an archaeological theory about the past, but it doesn't apply now, then actually that theory doesn't work. You should be able to excavate the present now. If your methods are any good, if your theories are real, you should be able to apply them in any time period in the archaeological past, including the now. And sort of reading up on all of that stuff. You know, this is everything from, the archaeology of World War I and World War II, but also up until and including just right now. So there's this amazing project in Manchester. I forget the name of the nightclub, but there was a nightclub in the 1980s that was such a important local hub, and it also happened to cater to a gay community when that wasn't really a thing. That was sort of it wasn't it wasn't a normal thing to have a place to go, you know, and it was an immigrant community as well. So there was lots of intersectionality in this community. And, over the years, a lot of people had a lot of memories there, but then it closed down and it was razed to the ground. And this many years later, a lot of those people were still around and they were going to develop the place. And in advance of development, they just a couple of people decided to sort of start seeing if they could excavate there, and there was an archaeological professional involved, and eventually it becomes an excavation of a nightclub from the 1980s. And they found like a urinal and lots of drug paraphernalia and the kind of thing that you would expect to find, but bringing it to the surface and asking all those people to come look at it, and then getting photographs, and then getting all this. It became such a social history, oral history project. It became almost like empowering in a way for this community to sort of recognize itself and saying this is heritage that is real and meaningful and has a power to it, that kind of thing. So so there was a course that I taught, and I just wasn't aware of any of this. I was, my head was in the Pictish past, and having to teach that course radicalized me, I'd like to say, into saying that archaeology is a way of looking at the world regardless of time period. And so each of these jobs has had, this is a roundabout way of saying, each time I move from one job to another, I open up another avenue, and I've been able to bring it back to early medieval archaeology. But I am, since the PhD, I have published a lot on early medieval burial, but I am now working on early Christian sculpture, carved stones, and my current job is about essentially Viking Age to early Norman stuff, and so each project involves another whole avenue that you've not really explored, which is all great, it keeps me on my toes. It keeps me reading things I wouldn't have read to begin with, and it helps me be a better archaeologist, a better scholar, all of it. But it leads a kind of disjunctured research agenda of my own, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So you've done some work on the carved stones. What are your highlights from that?
Oh, amazing. Okay, so I was lucky enough. So if you're interested in the Picts and early Christianity in Scotland, you deal with carved stones. There's Pictish symbol stones and cross slabs, and the museums are full of them, and they're out in the landscape, and they're amazing. If you go to the island of Iona, which I strongly suggest everybody do at one time in their life. Have you ever been?
I have not, actually, but I've always wanted to go. I know.
Okay, you're coming with me. I'm taking you there. Next time you're in Scotland, we'll make it happen. Anyways.
Excellent.
So if you deal with early Christianity and early medieval stuff in Scotland, you deal with carved stones. It's a lot of the evidence that we have. And it's amazing. It's it's unique in the world, the art that we have from the early medieval period in Scotland. So it was always on my radar. But one of the gigs that I got in the sort of postdoc years, I was lucky enough at Historic Scotland, what is now Historic Environment Scotland, then Historic Scotland. They're the agency that cares for a lot of the archaeology in Scotland, but they also run the visitor sites, including Iona. Iona was going to be redisplayed in 2013. And in the run-up to that, they reached out. This was Peter Yeoman, who was formerly of that parish, reached out to experts in all of the time periods of history relating to Iona, and they said they just kind of had everybody write up reports on what is known about Iona through time. And Kate Buchanan was tapped to do the sculpture. She needed a research assistant, and she brought me along. And through that, we did some new work on the carved stones of Iona, which we are bringing to publication soon.
Cool.
And then we did another run through a very much smaller site at Kirkmadrine, which is kind of the polar opposite. Iona has the largest collection of early medieval sculpture in Scotland, And Kirkmadrine has 3 really important Latin inscribed stones dating to the 6th century.
Yeah, that fascinates me. I had no idea that existed until you'd mentioned it.
Oh my God, yeah. Not enough people know about it. They're still there. They were being redisplayed on site, which is rarer and rarer. But they are 3 incredibly rare and in Scotland almost unique testaments to a Christianity, a Christian, functioning Christian institution with bishops and gravestones and maybe a monastery in the 6th century, which is, just very early for anywhere in Britain and Ireland. And it's, and there's 3 of them at this site, which has as far as we know, there's no archaeological evidence for, any early monastery there. And so it's kind of a mystery why those stones are there to this day. But there they are, and they're incredibly significant. Yeah.
What do they say?
One of them says, in a very neat Latin capitals, it says, "Here lies the sacred and venerated bishops," or it says sacerdote, and at that point that could mean a priest or a bishop. The venerated bishops, and it names a couple of them. Another stone just has the names of 2 others, and then the last stone says "Initium et Finis," the beginning and the end.
Yeah,
and a name on a stone, that's a gravestone with a cross on it. But "Initium et Finis," that is scripture.
Yeah.
And, to read that and know what it meant, you had to have read scripture,
Right.
And so that's the argument for this is a literate community, but specifically maybe a monastery. And they're monumentalizing their site with these crosses in a way that is just not happening on any other site in Scotland at that time. Incredibly significant. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other examples of Latin on stone?
They're very rare. And Kate Forsyth, who is a professor, recently made professor, well-deserved, of course,
excellent.
in Celtic and Gaelic, yes, at the University of Glasgow. Kate Forsyth, she's a specialist in Ogham, but really is an expert in all forms of ancient writing in early medieval Britain and beyond. And so she's worked on all of these, and she's done. She's the one that sort of has done the most work on them. There are 2 of them from neighboring Whithorn, and Whithorn is supposed to be the big monastery at this time in that area, but it's only got 2 of these stones, and they're quite scrappy for what they are. Although one is the earliest, the Latina stone goes back to the 5th century, and so we know that there are Christians in Scotland, at least in the southwest, from the 5th century. And then there's a couple of them, but they're only in southern Scotland, 5th, 6th, 7th century. There's I forget the actual number, but it's like about a dozen.
Yeah.
All told.
Wow. Yeah. That's so interesting. Cool.
Yeah. Early Christianity, man. Early medieval archaeology. It's where it's at.
Yeah. That's fascinating. Cool. Well, I look forward to learning more about that when the publication comes out. Yeah. Cool. And then I don't know, how much can you actually say about what you're doing right now?
Oh, plenty. So, so the current post is the Glenmorangie Research Fellowship. This is a program that's been running at the National Museum of Scotland since 2008. Glenmorangie, obviously, a world famous distillery of whiskey.
Yeah.
And they rebranded in 2008. And they chose as their logo, as they call it, the signet, a pattern that was taken from a Pictish stone on their estate. This is the Hilton of Cadboll stone, which is on their land, is now in the National Museum of Scotland in Edinburgh, but was found on the Glenmorangie estate. Yeah. And so they chose that as their inspiration. Their brand, their new logo was based on a Pictish pattern, a carving.
Right.
And so when they did that in 2008, they thought, let's put our money where our mouth is. Let's commission a new bit of research so that, we can kind of big up this time period that people might not know a lot about. And so they did a 3-year project there at the museum. They got a fellow who was Alice Blackwell at the time, who is now a curator of medieval archaeology. at the National Museum. Anyway, she was the first, and they did such a good job. They published a book called Early Medieval Scotland.
Yeah, I've just been like looking at it on my shelf, going like, yeah, that's the book.
That's it. That's the genesis. And it was just it has all the best, in a concise, readable way, a great bit of research on early medieval Scotland, and lots and lots and lots of beautiful photographs of early medieval objects in the National Museum.
It's a gorgeous book. It is.
That's it.
Oh.
And the project has kind of proceeded along those lines ever since then. They've done recreations of Pictish objects. They've done more books. Scotland's Early Silver was the last one.
Cool.
The project now, I'm lucky enough to be the fellow on the 4th phase. And this one, they're doing the same kind of thing, but they're focusing on the 9th to the 12th centuries. Anything in the national collection there at the museum falls under that window is potentially going to be in the book. So it's just
Excellent.
kind of a new look at the Viking Age and what comes after as well. It's
cool.
The end of the Picts, the end of Dalriada, the rise of Viking earldoms, the nation called Alba, Gaelic-speaking nation, and the roots of what became the Kingdom of Scotland in the 12th century.
Oh, fascinating.
And so the idea behind it, is new research on that time period. It's never been done. We've had Viking books. We've had books about 12th century Romanesque art, but we've never had a book that kind of covers this whole thing basically it's a transition from the early to the late medieval period as seen through the objects. Yeah. And we're coming out with a book, another lavishly illustrated book that'll be out in 2021, COVID dependent.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Well, I look forward to that one. These books are just so beautiful. They're in my, I don't have anything on my coffee table that is actually pretty right now because of a very young child who...
Yes. Keep those books out of the coffee table.
But it is one that someday will be sitting on the coffee table.
Great.
But yeah, they're so gorgeous. I love looking at the pictures in them. So if you're interested in looking at gorgeous pictures of stuff from early medieval Scotland, these books are for you. Yeah, well, thank you. One more thing before we sign off. You also have a bit of a side project that you kind of work on. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so since 2014, so this is when I was teaching that contemporary archaeology course I told you about. The challenge in that course, Archaeology in Contemporary Society, was to tell the students, here's something like a 19th century graveyard.
Okay.
Can you do something archaeological with this? And of course you can. You can survey it. You can map the gravestones. You can talk about the stone, the layout of the landscape, and all these things. And so the challenge was always take something that you think couldn't be made into, it couldn't be looked at archaeologically,
right,
and make archaeology out of it. And because I'm a real deep nerd. Again, I started with The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit. And so I started doing pop culture stuff. And, I did some real deep writing, man, like real heavy research on archaeologies of Middle Earth.
Excellent.
And, some of my best writing, I have to say, is on that stupid blog. It's called Almost Archaeology. I don't blog so much on it anymore these days. It's on hiatus because I have to do a lot of blogs for the museum as part of my job, and so I still tweet at Almost Arc, but it's about pop culture, contemporary society, and looking at it as an archaeologist would. So I've written about the archaeology of Harry Potter,
excellent,
the archaeology of Game of Thrones in some way, and things like that, So. One of my proudest blogs is one of my proudest achievements as an archaeologist was I wrote an archaeology of Blockbuster Video, the now defunct video rental chain.
Yes,
that kind of thing. So that was my nerdy sort of outlet. I still tweet about stuff like that, but I haven't written a blog in a wee while. But it's it'll come back at some point. In the meantime, there's lots of nerdy stuff on there. It's from a medievalist perspective as well, more often than not. So it might relate to your audience, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been really fun.
What? This has been a blast.
Thank you so much. I look forward to hearing more about your research in the future.
Great. Well, nice to finally virtually meet you.
Yeah.
All right. And hopefully we can talk again sometime.
Yeah, excellent. The Scotichronicast is just one of many things relating to medieval history on medievalists.net. If you like what you see and what you hear, consider being a patron on patreon.com/medievalists. Thank you for joining us on the Scotichronicast. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can also follow our account on Twitter @Scotichronicast. Our music is Ex te Lux Oratur by Gaita. Thanks for listening.